faces losing everything. 3:42 p.m. This is the story of Daniel Reeves and his wife, Chloe Reeves. Someone submitted this story a few weeks ago, and I've been sitting on it ever since. Not because it wasn't ready, but because it was almost too quiet to know what to do with. He sent it in on a Tuesday, no subject, just a message that started with, "I don't usually talk about this kind of thing, but something happened in March and I think I need to put it somewhere." What followed was 11 pages, single-spaced. The emotional tone throughout was something I'd describe as controlled, almost unnervingly so. Kind of calm that only exists in a person who has already done all of their falling apart in private, long before anyone else was watching. He mentions Chloe early. He mentions the folder even earlier. And somewhere in the middle there's a line he wrote, almost in passing. She said she could file for divorce anytime she wanted. I told her I knew. According to him, that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a room changes when someone opens a window in winter. This is what he shared. Here's how he told it. I'll try to explain it the way I remember it, which means I'll probably get some of the smaller details wrong, but the important parts right. That's how memory works, I've found. It blurs the furniture and sharpens the feeling. On the morning it actually happened, I had already been awake for 2 hours before Chloe came downstairs. The coffee was cold by then. I hadn't reheated it because I'd forgotten it was there, which was something that had been happening more frequently over the past year. Not forget things exactly, but losing track of them. Setting something down and then walking away and then returning to find it exactly where I'd left it, slightly worse for the time that had passed. Cold coffee, unread mail, conversations that started and then just quietly stopped. Our kitchen faced east. In the mornings, when the weather was right, the light came through the window above the sink at a particular angle that turned everything slightly gold. The countertops, the white cabinet doors, the ceramic fruit bowl that Chloe's mother had given us as a wedding gift and that we had never once put fruit in. It was beautiful, that light. I noticed it most on the mornings when I was already up and sitting alone before the house started moving around me. That was March. Specifically, it was the 14th. I know because I'd had a meeting with Mark the afternoon before, and Mark's office always had those little desk calendars, the paper kind that nobody uses anymore, and I'd noticed the date while he was talking. I sat at the kitchen table with my folder. I should explain what the folder was, though I'll get to that in its own time. For now, just know that it existed, that it had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my home office desk for approximately 4 months, and that I had moved it to the kitchen table that morning, with the specific intention of leaving it there. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I want to be clear about that. What I was planning was something closer to a conclusion, a quiet, overdue arrival at the end of a road I'd been walking down for a very long time. Chloe came downstairs at 8:30. She was wearing the gray robe, the heavy one she'd ordered from some boutique hotel website after we'd stayed at a place in Vermont 3 years ago, and she'd liked the texture of theirs. That robe had cost more than my first car payment. She wore it the way she wore most things she'd paid too much for, with a kind of proprietary ease, like it owed her something in return for the money. "You're up early," she said, not looking at me. She went to the coffee machine. I watched her pour a mug, add the oat milk. Always the oat milk, never the regular. And she'd once made me feel genuinely guilty for buying the wrong kind, and then lean against the counter with her back half turned. That was a posture I'd come to know intimately over the course of our marriage. The turned back. The particular angle of her shoulders that said she was present in the room, but not available in it. "Couldn't sleep," I said. She made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been nothing. I looked at the folder on the table and then looked back at my cold coffee and decided not to say anything else yet. We had been married for 6 years. I want to be careful here because this is the part that's easy to get wrong, easy to flatten into something simpler than it was. Chloe was not always the version of herself that she eventually became, and I was not always the version of myself that I was on that morning in March. We had loved each other. I believe that completely, even now. The early years had a texture to them that I still think about sometimes, not with longing exactly, but with the specific ache of something that was real and is now only a memory of realness. We met at a work event. She was in marketing. I was doing contract legal consulting before I transitioned fully into private practice, and she had walked into a room full of people and somehow made it feel like the room had been waiting for her. That was Chloe's particular gift. She understood spaces. She understood how to occupy them, how to arrange herself within them so that other people adjusted their positions accordingly, gravitating toward or away from her based on some invisible social physics she'd mastered long before I'd even thought about it. I had found that magnetism extraordinary. Later, I would come to understand it differently. Not as charm, exactly, but as control. Chloe needed to be the organizing principle of any room she was in. She needed to be the one others looked to, the one who determined the emotional temperature, the one who established what mattered and what didn't. In the early years of our marriage, this quality had made her feel dynamic and alive. She made decisions confidently, and they were usually right. She had opinions about everything, and most of them were interesting. She was the kind of person who made you feel, when she turned her full attention toward you, that you were somehow more real than you'd been a moment before. The problem with marrying that kind of person, I eventually discovered, is that they can also make you feel invisible when the attention moves elsewhere. And Chloe's attention had been moving elsewhere for a long time. I should introduce Mark here, because he matters to this story in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Mark Ellison had been my attorney for almost 8 years. First professionally, then personally, and eventually in ways that blurred the line between the two. He was the kind of lawyer who had the rare ability to be completely precise and completely human at the same time, which is harder than it sounds. He had an office downtown with leather chairs that were slightly too large for the space, and a window that looked out over a parking structure, and he had never once seemed to notice or care about the view. I had called him in November. Not in a panic, by then panic had long passed through me and settled into something quieter and more purposeful. I called him on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in my car in a parking lot outside a grocery store, because I hadn't wanted to make the call from inside the house. I need to understand something, I'd told him. All right, he said, the prenuptial agreement, specifically the financial conduct clause. There was a pause. Then, tell me what you found. That conversation had lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, I had a clearer picture of my situation than I'd had in 2 years. Mark was careful. He always was, but there was a moment near the end where he let the careful drop just slightly, and he said quietly, "Daniel, she underestimated you." I hadn't answered that. I didn't need to. The financial issues had started, as far as I could trace it, about 2.5 years into our marriage. I want to be precise here without being exhaustive, because the specifics are less important than the pattern. What Chloe had done was not dramatic or cinematic. It wasn't embezzlement in any classical sense. It was more like a slow rerouting. Money that should have flowed in one direction gradually redirected, over months and then years, toward accounts and arrangements that served her alone. She had a business, a consulting practice she'd started the year after we married, and the business was genuinely successful. That part was true, and I had always been proud of her for it. But somewhere along the way, the business had also become a structure for separating what was ours from what was hers in ways that our prenuptial agreement explicitly governed. She had a lawyer too, of course, but her lawyer hadn't read our prenuptial agreement as carefully as Mark had. Or perhaps Chloe hadn't told her lawyer everything. Either way, by November I had documents, specific ones, with dates and figures and a paper trail that Mark described with characteristic understatement as pretty thorough. Back in the kitchen, Chloe had moved from the counter to the island where she was scrolling her phone with one hand and holding her coffee mug with the other. She hadn't looked at the folder on the table. I wasn't sure if she hadn't noticed it or was choosing not to notice it. With Chloe, those two things could be impossible to distinguish. "Do you have anything today?" she asked, not looking up. "Some calls in the afternoon," I said. "Nothing urgent. I have lunch with Andrea." Andrea was one of Chloe's closest friends, and one of the people I had spent the most time not thinking about for the past several months. She was relevant to the situation in a way I wasn't going to get into at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. "That's fine," I said. I wasn't asking permission. "I know." She finally looked up from her phone, and the look she gave me was one I recognized, the faint narrowing of the eyes that meant she was calibrating, assessing whether my calm was a challenge or a capitulation. With Chloe, she always needed to know which one it was. She couldn't operate in the space between. "You seem strange this morning," she said. "I'm just tired." She looked at me for another moment, then back at her phone. I looked at the folder. I did not open it yet. That moment wasn't ready. But it was close. The marriage had entered its current phase, I think, around the time Chloe's business crossed a certain threshold of success. This is not me saying success ruined her. I don't believe that cleanly. But I do think that certain people have a version of themselves that expands to fill available space, and when the space is large enough, the expansion can become something else. Something that crowds out other things. She had won an industry award in the second year of her business. A regional thing, not huge, but real. I had taken her to dinner that night, and she had been genuinely happy. The warm, slightly disbelieving happiness of someone who wanted something badly, and then actually got it. And I remember thinking, sitting across from her at the restaurant, that this was exactly the version of her I had fallen in love with. By the award's second anniversary, she had 2 employees, a featured profile in a trade publication, and a way of speaking about her work that no longer included the word we. By the third, I had started sleeping on the wrong side of a conversation, not the wrong side of the bed. We still shared the bed, still maintained the surface habits of a functioning marriage. But in conversations, particularly the ones that mattered, I had noticed myself on a side that felt like the outside. She talked at me more than with me. She talked about her clients and her decisions and her plans with the enthusiasm of someone telling a good story to an audience, not sharing a life with a partner. I had tried for a while to re-enter those conversations. Eventually, I had stopped trying, started listening differently. Not for connection, but for information. That shift, I think, is what she never saw coming, because Chloe had long ago decided what kind of man I was, and I had let her. She left for her lunch at 11:30. Before she left, she kissed me on the cheek, a habit so automatic it had ceased to be an act of affection and become something more like punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence that neither of us had finished. I sat at the table after she left. I looked at the folder. I opened it, not for the first time, and read through it slowly, the way you read something that you've already decided about but still want to be certain of. Every page was familiar. The prenuptial agreement, with the specific clause on page 7, financial conduct and joint asset obligations, highlighted in yellow. The documentation Mark had helped me organize. Account records, transfer histories, the consulting firm's financial disclosures. And at the very back, a single page that Mark had prepared, a summary of what it all meant in plain language without equivocation. I closed the folder, I left it on the table, and I waited. She came home at 4. She was in a good mood. Andrea lunches often left her this way, loose and slightly self-satisfied, like she'd been reminded of everything she was. She dropped her bag by the door, which she always did and which always irritated me and which I had long since stopped mentioning. "How were the calls?" she asked. "Fine." She noticed the folder. I watched her notice it. There was the briefest pause, just a fraction of a second, a small catch in the way she was moving. And then she continued to the refrigerator. "What's that?" she asked, too casually. "Just some paperwork," I said. "Nothing urgent." She made a sound and poured herself a glass of water. I watched her back, the way her shoulders held themselves, and thought about all the times I had watched her back in this kitchen and read it wrong. I didn't think I was reading it wrong today. The conversation that followed was an ordinary one. Surface things, dinner plans, a comment about something she'd seen on her phone. But underneath it, I could feel the shift already beginning. Something in the room had changed its weight distribution. She didn't ask about the folder again, not yet. But she would. She asked about the folder 3 days later. I'm not sure what I expected. Some part of me had wondered if she'd pick it up herself, open it, see what was inside. She didn't. Either she wasn't curious enough, or she was more careful than curiosity, which I suspected was closer to the truth. Chloe had always been more strategic than impulsive, even when she appeared to be acting on instinct. The instincts were real, but they were trained. On the evening of the 17th, we were eating dinner at the kitchen table. Something I'd made, because cooking had become one of my few remaining acts of domestic participation that felt genuine rather than performative, and she looked at the folder, which had remained on the table's edge for 3 days because I had left it there deliberately, and she said, "You never told me what that was." "Which thing?" "The folder. The one that's been sitting there." I looked at it as though reminded of its existence. "Just some documents, for a client." "Not exactly." She waited. Chloe had extraordinary patience for waiting when she wanted information. It was a technique I'd watched her deploy in other contexts, with clients, with vendors, with friends who were working up to confessing something. She would simply go still and let the silence do the work. I let the silence sit this time without filling it. She picked up her fork. "You've been strange lately. You've mentioned. Have you talked to someone? A therapist, or no, maybe you should." The way she said it, the slight lift at the end, the particular register of concern that was also faintly dismissive, the tone of someone managing rather than caring, I recognized all of it. I'd been on the receiving end of that tone for 2 years and had spent considerable time decoding it. It meant, "I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about what you represent to the current equilibrium." "I'm fine," I said. "How's Andrea?" The subject changed. The folder stayed on the table. Over the following week, I noticed Chloe doing something I hadn't seen her do in a long time, paying attention to me. Not the warm kind, not the kind that meant she was engaged or interested or emotionally present, the calibrating kind. She was watching me the way you watch a room you've just walked into, when something feels subtly rearranged, when you can't immediately identify what's different, but you know, with certainty, that something is. She started asking about my work with slightly more specificity than usual. Not enough to seem pointed. Chloe was too skilled for that, but enough that I noticed the shift. She asked about a case I was consulting on. She asked about Mark. Why Mark specifically, I asked. You mentioned him last week, she said, which was not true. Did I? Thought you did. I let that pass. She also started being intermittently nicer. Small things, offering to pour my coffee before I'd asked, a hand on my arm when she passed behind me in the kitchen, a question about something I'd mentioned weeks ago that she'd apparently been holding on to. Each gesture was individually unremarkable. Together they formed a pattern I recognized as vigilance. She thought something was coming, she didn't know what. I should say something about what our evenings used to look like, before everything shifted into what they eventually became, because it matters for understanding how far things had drifted. In the early years we would sit together after dinner, on the couch, at the table, sometimes outside on the back step if the weather allowed, and just talk. Not about logistics. Not about schedules or clients or whatever Andrea had said over lunch. Just about things, ideas, memories, observations. She had a way of thinking about ordinary things that made them feel extraordinary, a gift for reframing the mundane into something worth examining, and I had spent hours in those conversations feeling genuinely lucky. That had stopped, gradually. Gradually enough that I hadn't noticed the moment it stopped, only the long absence afterward. Now our evenings looked like two people in the same room with different screens, occasionally intersecting around logistics, occasionally sharing silence that was no longer comfortable but had become familiar enough to pass as comfort. I had mourned that, quietly, privately, over a long stretch of time. And at some point the mourning had completed itself. Not resolved, not healed, but finished. And what remained was something cooler and more clear-eyed. You can miss something and also accept that it's gone. Those two things can coexist. The dinner with her family happened the weekend before everything broke open. Her mother drove up from Philadelphia, a 4-hour trip, which her mother always made seem longer, and her younger brother Elliot came with his wife and their 2-year-old. The house was full in the way it only was a handful of times a year, and Chloe moved through it with the ease and grace of a person in her natural habitat, orchestrating everything, drawing the family together around her like a gravitational center. I watched her from across the room. I watched her tell a story that made everyone laugh. I watched her carry her nephew in one arm while refilling someone's glass with the other. I watched her for approximately 3 hours be exactly the person I had fallen in love with. I want to be honest about what that did to me, not because it changed anything, but because pretending it didn't affect me would be a lie, and I've tried to be accurate in this account. It affected me, not enough to alter what I'd decided, but enough to sit in. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I was washing dishes and Chloe was putting things away, and there was a moment of domestic parallel that felt, briefly, like the old thing, like the version of us that used to work. Your mom seems good, I said. She's always good. She just likes to perform tired. Elliot's kid is getting big. He looks like Elliot, she said, which was her way of dismissing the compliment, because Elliot was not someone Chloe found particularly remarkable. I handed her a pot to dry. She took it without looking at me. Daniel, she said after a pause. Yeah, are we okay? I was quiet for a moment. The dish in my hand was heavier than it should have been. Or maybe I was just aware of its weight in a way I hadn't been before. What do you mean by okay? I asked. Don't do that. Do what? Answer a question with a question. You know what I mean. I looked at the window above the sink. The night beyond it was flat and dark, the kind of dark that makes a kitchen feel isolated from everything outside of it. I thought about how to answer honestly without answering completely, which is a specific kind of restraint that I'd gotten better at over the course of that winter. I think we're in a complicated place, I said finally. She dried the pot in silence. Is it fixable? She asked very quietly. I don't know, I said, which was true. Or at least it had been true once. She nodded slowly, as though I'd confirmed something she'd already believed. Then she set the pot on the stove and left the kitchen without saying anything else. I stood at the sink for another few minutes in the way I sometimes did, not processing anything, just standing in the fact of where I was. The folder was still on the table. I didn't look at it. I wonder sometimes about that moment, whether something different in my answer would have changed the trajectory of the following week. Probably not. Probably the track was already laid before that conversation happened, and we were already moving along it, and what felt like a choice was actually just a rival. I don't know. Maybe if I'd said something else. Maybe if she had. I've replayed that moment too many times to tell anymore. The fourth wall is a strange concept, I realize. I don't usually think about the fact that this will be someone's story, out there somewhere, that someone will read it or listen to it or, I don't know, like it or subscribe or something. It's strange to think about. This is my life. These are the actual rooms. This is the actual pot that was heavier than it should have been. Anyway, the week after the family dinner, Chloe became more distant. That was interesting to me. I'd expected the vigilance to continue, or perhaps to intensify. Instead, something in her seemed to resolve itself into a different register, quieter, but not softer. The way a storm isn't loud the whole way through. She went about her work with the usual intensity. She had a client presentation midweek that she'd been preparing for, and she disappeared into it the way she always disappeared into professional things, completely and without apology. I didn't begrudge her that. The work was real and the work mattered to her, and I had stopped resenting the hours she gave to it long before I'd stopped being affected by the hours she didn't give to us. On Thursday evening, she came home from the office later than usual. I had already eaten. She made herself something small and stood at the counter to eat it, which was a new habit, standing while eating like someone who doesn't intend to stay. "Presentation go okay?" I asked. "Fine," she said. "They loved it." "Good. Marcus said it was the best deck they'd seen in 2 years. That's a real compliment, I know." She said it without the false modesty she sometimes deployed when she thought it was appropriate. Just direct acknowledgement. I had always liked that directness in her when it was genuine. She finished eating, she rinsed her plate, and then she turned, and something in her posture had shifted. The careful watching was gone, or rather it had consolidated into something else, something that felt more like a decision reached. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About us." She folded her arms, not defensively but carefully. "About where this goes." I waited. "I think we've been not quite right for a while," she said. "And I've been patient about it, but I'm starting to wonder if patient is the right response." "What would the right response be?" She looked at me steadily. There was something familiar and something new in that look. The steadiness was familiar, but underneath it was something I hadn't seen before. A kind of preliminary departure. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I'm getting clearer." She went upstairs. I sat with the folder on the table. She said it on a Saturday. It was the kind of morning that has no drama built into its surface. Pale gray light. The sound of rain that isn't quite rain. The smell of coffee and something burnt that might have been toast. I was at the kitchen table again. She came down in the gray robe again. The scene was almost identical to the morning 2 weeks earlier, and I think she might have noticed that too. The conversation didn't start with the line she said. It started with something else, something about plans for the weekend, about whether I'd remembered to call the contractor about the gutter on the east side of the house. Normal things, maintenance things, the connective tissue of a shared life that continues to function even when the life underneath it doesn't. And then somewhere in the middle of it, not at a dramatic peak, not after a significant exchange, just somewhere in the middle, the way things that have been building often do. She said it. "You know I can file for divorce anytime I want." She said it the way you say something you've been holding carefully and have finally decided to set down. Not a shout, not even a statement exactly. More like a reminder of a fact she assumed we both already knew, delivered for the specific purpose of clarifying the power structure. I looked at her. She was watching me with that steadiness she had, the unblinking confidence of someone who has assessed the room and knows where she stands in it. "I know," I said. "I'm not saying I'm going to. I'm saying I could." She paused. "I think it's important for you to understand that." "Important how?" She tilted her head. "Because sometimes I think you forget that this is something I'm choosing, that I have options." I was quiet for a moment, and then I did something I hadn't planned to do, or rather, something I had planned without articulating it to myself as a plan. I looked at the folder. I looked at her. Not a sharp smile, not triumphant or cruel or staged for effect. It was more like the smile of someone who has arrived at the end of a very long walk and recognizes the landscape. "I know you could file," I said. I reached out and slid the folder across the table toward her. "So could I said, "and I've already talked to Mark." She looked at the folder. She didn't pick it up immediately. Chloe was not someone who reached for things she wasn't ready for. She assessed first, always. I watched her assess the folder's weight, its thickness, the fact that it had been sitting on this table for 2 weeks, and I had neither explained it nor removed it. I watched her understand in the space of about 3 seconds this was not a coincidence. "What is this?" she asked. Her voice was even. Controlled. She was very good at controlled. "Open it," I said. She opened it. She was quiet for a long time. I watched her read. I knew what she was finding. I had organized the contents carefully, with Mark's guidance, in a specific order designed for clarity rather than impact. The prenuptial agreement first. Page 7, the financial conduct clause, highlighted in yellow because I hadn't wanted her to have to search for it. Then the documentation. Account statements, transfer records, the specific transactions that fell outside the bounds of what we had agreed to in that document 8 years ago. She turned to the summary page at the back, the one Mark had written in plain language. She put it down. She looked at me. For the first time in a very long time. Possibly the first time since I'd known her, I saw something in Chloe's face that I didn't have a name for immediately. It wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something more fundamental than either of those. The specific expression of a person who has just discovered that the room they thought they were in charge of had different architecture than they believed. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "I built them," I said. "Over time. How long? Long enough." She looked at the folder again, not opening it this time, just looking at the outside of it. Then she looked at the table, then at her hands. "The prenup," she said. Her voice had shifted, still controlled, but the control was working harder now. "I had a lawyer review that. I know. She told me." She stopped. "She may not have read it as carefully as Mark did," I said. "Specifically the financial conduct clause, the threshold figures, the reporting requirements." I paused. "There are a few things in there that I think got missed." Chloe was silent. This is the moment I had imagined and not imagined for 4 months. I say not imagined because I had genuinely tried not to rehearse it too many times. Rehearsal, I'd found, created a performance, and I hadn't wanted performance. I'd wanted this, the quiet of it, the weight of facts in a room. "I'm not trying to threaten you," I said, because this was true and I needed her to know it was true. "I'm not trying to scare you or punish you or make some kind of point about who's in control." She looked up. "I'm trying to finish something," I said, honestly, and with as little damage as possible. She stared at me for a long moment. I could see her processing, not just the information, but me. The version of me that had been sitting in this kitchen, across from her for the last 2 weeks with a folder on the table. She was adjusting an image she'd held for years, and I could see the difficulty of that adjustment in real time. "How much do you know?" she asked. Not combatively, just directly. "Everything in that folder," I said, "which is most of it." She nodded slowly. "What happens now?" she said. "That depends on how we do this," I said. "Mark has outlined a couple of paths. One of them is better for both of us. The other is better for neither of us. And you're going to let me choose. I think you deserve to understand the options before anything is filed." She looked at me for a long time. The rain, the thing that had been almost rain all morning, finally committed to being actual rain. We could both hear it. She didn't look away. "I didn't think you'd do this," she said finally. Not accusatory, just observational. Honest in the way that she could be under the right conditions. "I know," I said. "I thought you just." She didn't finish the sentence. "I had a few ideas about how it might have ended. I thought you'd just keep being what you were. Or, I thought you'd just leave quietly. Or maybe, I thought you'd just absorb it the way you absorbed everything else." I waited for her to finish it. She didn't. "I've changed some since you formed that opinion of me," I said, gently, without any edge. She looked at the folder one more time. She looked at her hands. She looked out the window at the rain. And then, very quietly, she said, "Tell me about the paths." We talked for 2 hours. I won't reconstruct all of it. Some of it was practical, numbers, timelines, documentation requirements. Some of it was harder. At one point, she asked a question that I hadn't expected and didn't have a clean answer to. Something about whether I had ever considered just talking to her instead of preparing, and I sat with that for a moment before answering honestly. "I tried," I said, "early on, different versions of it." She was quiet. "You didn't want to hear it," I said, not cruelly, just as a fact. She didn't argue with that, which was, I think, its own kind of answer. At the end of 2 hours, she said she needed a few days. I said that was reasonable. She asked if I would be consulting with Mark in the meantime, and I said yes, but I wouldn't be taking any unilateral steps without telling her first. She nodded. She picked up her coffee, cold by now like mine had been 2 weeks earlier, and looked at it and set it back down. "I need to call my lawyer," she said. "Okay, a different one. That's probably a good idea." She stood up. She looked at the folder one last time, not with anger, not with defeat, but with the expression of someone taking an accurate measurement of something they'd misjudged. Then she left the kitchen. I sat alone at the table. The folder was between us, between where I was sitting and where she had been, and I looked at it for a while. This thing I had built. This careful, quiet architecture of facts. I had not wanted it to exist. I had not wanted any of this to exist. But it did exist, and I had built it, and it had sat on this table for 2 weeks until it needed to be what it was. I thought about the first night Chloe and I had spent in this house. How she had stood in this kitchen before we had infurch and turned in a slow circle and said, "I think this is the one," and the way she'd looked when she said it, not just pleased, but certain. The kind of certainty I had loved in her before I understood what it cost to live beside it. The rain was steady now. I left the folder where it was. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful, but quieter than the story I'd been telling myself about what this would look like. I'd prepared for a version of things that involved more noise, more edges. Chloe was many things, but she was not someone I'd ever known to lose gracefully. I had anticipated a fight, even if not a dramatic one. What I got instead was something more complicated. She retained a new attorney. I knew this because Mark mentioned it in early April. They had made contact, begun the process of preliminary documentation exchange. The name he mentioned was someone with a stronger reputation than her previous counsel, which I took as a sign that she was taking the situation seriously. She was still in the house for the first month. We had agreed to that for practical reasons. Logistics, finances, the simple mechanics of an ending that doesn't happen instantly just because it's been decided. We moved around each other in the rooms we'd shared for 6 years with a courtesy that was strange in its formality and strangely functional. We said good morning. We didn't discuss the folder. We didn't discuss much of anything that mattered. But we didn't fight either. I had expected fighting. Its absence was both a relief and, in some quiet way I couldn't quite name, a loss. Because fighting would have meant there was still something to fight about. Chloe left the house in the middle of May. She stayed with Andrea initially, which was a choice I had complicated feelings about and chose not to voice. By June she had her own apartment. I knew this from Mark, who knew it from the paperwork. A one-bedroom in a neighborhood she'd mentioned once or twice over the years as somewhere she liked, near good restaurants and a park she used to run in. I thought about that sometimes, that she had chosen a neighborhood she actually wanted to live in, which meant she'd been imagining this in some form long before I had. Or maybe she'd just always liked that neighborhood and I was reading into things. That's the trouble with the end of a marriage. Everything becomes evidence of something, even the things that aren't. I had dinner with Mark in July. Not a work dinner, a regular dinner, the kind that had grown up out of our professional relationship over the years into something resembling actual friendship. We went to a place downtown he liked, with a wine list he understood better than me, and a noise level that meant we occasionally had to lean toward each other to hear. "She's cooperative," he told me. "More than I expected." "She's strategic," I said. "Cooperative is strategic when cooperative is the better option." Still, he considered his wine. "You handled this well." I didn't answer that immediately. I appreciated what he meant, but I wasn't sure handled was the right word for what I'd done. I'd prepared. I'd waited. I'd told the truth at the right moment. That felt less like handling and more like patience. "Do you think she knew the whole time?" I asked. "About what the financial conduct clause covered." "I think she knew enough to not look too hard," he said. That was probably right. Chloe's particular talent was not for deception in the blunt sense, but for creative uncertainty. The careful management of what she knew and didn't know, such that she could always claim the latter when convenient. "She had an exit strategy before I did," I said. "Probably," Mark agreed, "but yours was better." We finished dinner. Outside it was still warm, July heat that sat heavy and specific, the kind that makes the city smell like itself. I drove home to the house that was mine now in a way it hadn't quite been before, quiet and full of furniture that remembered her, and I sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on many lights. I should say something about the reframing, because it happened and I think it's important. By August, Chloe had begun, through various mutual acquaintances and eventually through a post she made on a private social account that someone told me about, to narrate the end of our marriage in a way that centered her as the one who had left, by choice, from a relationship that no longer served her. The folder in this version was a hostile legal overreach. My preparation was obsessive. The financial documentation was a mischaracterization of my business practices. I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated some version of reframing. It was almost structurally required. Chloe's identity was tied to the image of herself as competent, decisive, in control of her own story. The events of March had complicated that image significantly. Narrative revision was not a character flaw, it was self-preservation. What surprised me faintly was how little it bothered me. I had expected to be angry when I heard she was shaping the story differently. Instead, I found I had very little reaction. Not because I didn't care about the truth. I did and do, but because I realized that Chloe's version of events was not really about me, it was about her. It was the story she needed to tell herself in order to keep moving forward, and I understood, in some way I hadn't expected to, that keeping her moving forward was not the worst outcome. She was not a villain. She had done things that were wrong. Those two things coexisted without contradiction. I thought about that a lot in August. The divorce was finalized in late October. The second path, the better for both of us one, had held. The financial conduct clause had been applied as written. There were adjustments that favored me, and adjustments that met her in the middle, and both of us had signed and both of us had moved on. Mark had been characteristically precise about the whole thing. I had thanked him in a way that probably didn't adequately convey what the last year had meant. He had looked at me the afternoon we finalized the last of it and said, "You're going to be fine." "I know," I said. "She might be too," he said eventually. "I know that too." He nodded. He understood, I think, that I didn't wish her badly, that the opposite of being wronged is not revenge, it's just the absence of being wronged, the return to an honest footing, the standing on ground that you know the composition of. I drove home in October light. The trees along the route I always took were doing the thing they do in late autumn in this part of the country, burning up in colors that are beautiful specifically because they're dying, which has always struck me as one of nature's stranger editorial decisions. I went inside, I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. The folder was gone, had been gone since August, filed with Mark's office, where it belonged. The table was just a table now. I sat there for a while. She called in December. I hadn't expected to hear from her. The process had been completed through attorneys. The house had been resolved. The last of the practical threads had been tied off with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized the whole of it. There was nothing left, technically, that required us to speak. She called on a Thursday evening. I saw her name on the phone and sat with it for a moment, watched it ring twice, 3 times, and then I answered. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A pause. "This is strange," she said. "A little," I agreed. "I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." I almost didn't. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. "That's fair." I was standing in the kitchen, near the window, where the light used to come through golden in the mornings. It was evening now and dark outside, and the window was just a dark square that showed me the faint reflection of the room behind me. "How are you?" I asked. "Okay," she said. "Getting there." A pause. "The apartment is good. I've been running again." "That's good." "I know." She paused. "How's the house?" "The same," I said. "I repainted the hallway. The blue one, beige now." "That's very you," she said, and there was something almost warm in it. Almost. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She was quiet for a moment, too. The silence between us had changed since March. It had a different texture now. Less weight, more distance. The specific silence of two people who share a significant past and a very limited present. "I wanted to," she started, then stopped. I waited. "I'm not going to apologize," she said. "I know that's probably what you're thinking, that I called to apologize." "I wasn't thinking that," I said. "I'm not saying I didn't. The things weren't." She stopped again. "I'm just saying that's not why I called." "Okay, why'd you call?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't completely know," she said. And I believed her, because it was the most unguarded thing I'd heard her say in years, possibly in the entire marriage. Chloe always knew why she was doing something. The not knowing was new. The admission of it was newer. "That's okay," I said. "I think I wanted to say that I underestimated you," she said. Very carefully, like someone setting down something fragile. "And I know that's not an apology, but I think it's true." I looked at the dark window, at the faint reflection of the kitchen behind me. "I know you did," I said. I didn't think I was doing it consciously." "I know that too," a long silence. "Did you plan it from the beginning?" she asked. "The folder, all of it." "No," I said. "I planned it from the moment I realized we weren't going to find our way back to each other. Before that, I was still hoping." She was quiet. "When did you stop hoping?" she asked. I thought about the answer honestly. "The gutter conversation," I said. "Which one?" "There were several. That's sort of the point." She made the sound again, the almost law that wasn't quite. "Yeah," she said. "I suppose it is." We were quiet together for a moment. Outside I could hear a car passing on the street, the refrigerator cycling on, the specific winter silence of a house in December. "I hope you're okay, Daniel," she said finally. "I mean that." "I know you do," I said. "And I did. I'm going to go," she said.
Okay, take care of yourself.
"You too, Chloe." She was quiet for one more second, just a second, barely a pause, the kind that might not mean anything or might mean everything. And then the call ended. I stood in the kitchen. I didn't move for a while. There's a thing that happens after the end of something significant, once the documentation is filed and the furniture has been redistributed and the hallway has been repainted beige. The thing is, life continues. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but in the way that it always does, with coffee and contractors and the particular quality of morning light through east-facing windows. I noticed the light again in January. The first time since everything. The first morning I stood at the sink, before the house started moving around me, and noticed that it was gold. Just gold, coming through the window, turning the counter and the cabinet doors and the ceramic fruit bowl that I still hadn't put fruit in. I stood there and looked at it. I thought about Chloe saying, "I can file for divorce anytime I want," with the confidence of someone who had read the room wrong. I thought about the way her face had changed when she opened the folder, not dramatic, not shattered, just shifted. A recalibration. An honest accounting. I thought about the question she'd asked on the phone in December. "Did you plan it from the beginning?" No, I had planned it from the moment I'd stopped hoping. Before that, I'd been just a person in a marriage that was drifting, trying to find the thing that would stop the drift, doing all the ordinary, inadequate things people do when they love someone who has stopped being available to be loved, in the ways they know how to offer. The folder was not a weapon, it was a record, a history written in numbers and dates and legal language that said, "I was here paying attention, even when you thought I wasn't. I was always here." I think that's what she had actually underestimated. Not my preparation, not the prenuptial clause, not Mark's careful reading of what she'd overlooked. Just that I had been paying attention, that I had continued to pay attention quietly and without announcement, long after she had decided what kind of man I was and stopped looking. People do that. They decide what someone is and then stop looking at them. And the person continues to be things, continues to change and observe and build and understand, in the space of being unseen. I had been unseen for a long time. I was fine with being seen now. The fruit bowl is still empty. I've thought about filling it, genuinely thought about it, not as symbolism, just as a practical thing. I walk past it every morning, and occasionally it occurs to me that it's a bowl specifically designed to hold fruit, and I have never once put fruit in it, and there's something slightly absurd about that. I haven't filled it yet. Maybe I will. The light came through this morning and turned it golden for a few minutes, the way it does when the weather is right, and I stood at the sink with my coffee. Hot, this time, because I've gotten better at remembering to drink it, and I looked at the bowl and the light and the whole quiet, ordinary, beautiful fact of a kitchen in January, and I thought, this is enough. This is actually enough, not perfect, not resolved in any clean way, not healed, necessarily, though I think healing is happening in the slow way it actually does. Not like water being poured into a glass, but like something geological, movement too deep to see in the moment. Just enough. The folder is at Mark's office. The table is just a table. The light is gold for a few minutes every morning. When the weather is right, I drink my coffee before it gets cold. That's where I am.